Dit Kate Mielfalcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Saturday, for anyone who doesn't know that. And it's time for our book. And I'm looking outside right now because I'm seeing blossoms on the fruit trees. And it's hailing and snowing and thundering at the same time. It's apocalyptic. It's very unusual. But that's the end of the weather report. So the book we're doing today, The Devil Never Sleeps by Juliette, Kayyem. Now this book turned out to be not what I expected. So by the time I figured it out, I was about 2 chapters in and I had dedicated a couple of days to it. And I didn't think I'd have enough time to do a different book. I like this book a lot. But it wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Here's what I was assuming. That it was going to be full of helpful hints and coping strategies. And it is, but on a much larger scale, not on a personal scale. So what I decided to do, because it is so interesting, was to continue with the book, condense my presentation of it a little, and add some stuff at the end that I researched on my own. So I hope you enjoy this. It's not politically, so that you're pulled in emotionally. It's not like the book we read last week by Jamie Raskin. It's not metaphysical or anything like that. It's a kind of a departure. I really enjoyed it. So I'm hoping you will too. And it's called The Devil Never Sleeps by Juliette Kayyem. And let me read to you a little bit about her biography. Now, I learned about her. She's on CNN all the time. She's a talking head. And I always was struck at the beginning of the pandemic about how reasonable a person she was. Since then, I've heard her interviewed on podcasts, how I found out about her book. And she fooled me into thinking it was slightly different than it is. But it's still good, so hang in there. And if you want some practical suggestions, helpful hints, at the end of the book, that's what I'm going to do. So Juliette Kayyem is an international leader in crisis management, disaster response, and homeland security. She's presently on the faculty of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Previously, she served as President Obama's assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. A CNN national security analyst, Pulitzer Prize finalist, it's a good book, and a frequent contributor to The Atlantic, Kayyem also advises governors, mayors, and corporations on crisis management. She's the author or editor of 6 books and has 3 kids and lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband. And the subtitle is Learning to Live in an Age of Disasters. Interestingly enough, what happens this week? The subway incident in Brooklyn. I'm telling you, there are no coincidences. So, let's read this. Written in 2022. The Devil Never Sleeps by Juliette Kayyem. Learning to Live in an Age of Disaster. She's an expert on disaster and crisis management. She prepares businesses and government entities for what they least expect. And we're going to get into that, and it certainly will shift your mind. She got the title from a woman that she met picking through the pieces after a big tornado had killed more than 100 people in Joplin, Missouri in 2011. This woman said, "The devil never sleeps, but he only wins if we don't do better the next time." So that's her philosophy. Then she starts the book out, this is still the prologue, with a really interesting story. And I thought, this story is going to appeal to everybody. As I said, no coincidences. So, during lockdown, she has 3 teenagers, 2 in high school, boys, and a daughter starting college at the time. And very unhappily, they were stuck at home during the big lockdown in March of 2020. And her sons apparently had the use of a separate bathroom and didn't tell her that the fan for moisture in the bathroom was broken. She has no idea how long this situation went on. She found out about it when plaster started falling in chunks off the ceiling of the bathroom. So in the middle of this crisis epidemic, she had to call in work guys to come and fix the moisture, and they had to get into the bones of this house, which was built in the early 1800s, a 3-story, really old house. And above the bathroom, the 3rd floor, is considered attic, but it's been modeled so that there's a bedroom where her daughter stayed with a bathroom, and then separate storage, and then, space, because it's an attic. And the guys pulling out the rest of the drywall on the ceiling said to her, do you realize there's a boarded up room upstairs in the attic? So here's the story. This house was built in the early 1800s, and at that time it was customary, if you could afford it, if you were building your own home, it's 1840, to put in what they called an infirmary room. And they usually selected a place away from the rest of the family for privacy, because it was used for birthing. It was used if you had a family member who was dying, so they wanted quiet. It was also used to isolate people if they had a contagious disease, which happened all the time because they had no way of mitigating that sort of thing. And when the contractor broke into the room, it had been completely walled up. They had no idea that there was anything behind that wall. When they broke into this room, they only discovered one item: a sepia-colored photograph of a man from around the turn of the century, 1900s. They weren't sure, 1920s maybe. And because they were bored, they decided to investigate. Who was this man? What was this all about? So they went down a rabbit hole on Facebook, with genealogy and the records of the house ownership and total investigation of who owned the house. And they traced all the owners back. They found out who all the families were. And they finally figured out, going through records, public records, who this man was. And the story will just blow your mind. This man had lived in the house, a relatively young man, lived in the house with his young family. And eventually they had a daughter who was 19. And in 1919, the daughter came down with the Spanish flu and stayed in that bedroom, the infirmary bedroom, and died in the infirmary bedroom. And he and his wife were so completely devastated, they boarded up the room after she, was buried and died and was buried. They just couldn't stay there. It was too much, and they ended up leaving the community. The house changed hands and people forgot. So 100 years later, during the next pandemic, that room is discovered. And she believes, she says in the book, this is a very karmic experience, and this is a very scientifically inclined, rational, give me evidence type of person, working for the government, working for, not someone giving to flights of fancy. But she was shook by this discovery and the parallels. So she says, 2 families united across time. And she said, why? Because the devil returned. So in her introduction, she says, what's in a name? And she said that the word disaster and the word catastrophe both have astrological legacies. The word disaster is a sudden destructive event that brings great damage and loss. It comes from the Latin dis, negative force, and astro, star. It's a bad star. Interesting, huh? The alignment of fate affects the future fate. And an ill-fated star brings down negative happenings on Earth. This is what the Romans believed. Catastrophe also comes from the Greek and the Latin and has to do with a thing that is related and occurs because of the stars. So we're usually in a state of amnesia. It's as if we had no agency at all to manage disaster. She says it's very human to bury the dead, rebuild and move on, just like these people did in her house. It's a very human thing to want to compartmentalize disaster, move on from it, not think about it. And that's one of the reasons why I stuck with this book, because you'll notice a thread throughout the book, her advice about facing the possibility, the future potential of bad things happening, facing it head on. And here's how you handle it. So, this is from the book. As I write this, the world is roiled by the COVID-19 pandemic with its recurrent waves and seemingly endless variations. Fresh from this experience, surely we all know the proverbial stars will misalign again. The Texas ice storm that eviscerated the state's electrical grid, a large tanker ship stuck in the Suez Canal, a hack against our gas pipelines, perhaps a hurricane, a flood, a wildfire, a drought, a Miami apartment building falling to the ground, a Travis Scott concert. Oh, is that the guy that the people were killed at the I thought she was making a comment about some musician. I don't know anything about him. But I think she's talking about like a crowd disaster. Space debris, the list is endless. Where even to start? Where to end? This spoil of riches is the point. For there to be a start, it assumes a finish. For the war to end, it assumes there was once peace. For you to stop worrying, it assumes there was a time of unicorns and rainbows when days were carefree and weightless. I'm here to disabuse you of this notion. There is no finish line. She says we need to stop obsessing about the past and the future and just focus on doing better today. And the devil is indifferent to our need to give disaster just one name. We have to prepare for the broadest scale of potentials. Our connectivity is a strength for us, but it's also a vulnerability, our modern connectivity. She says we need to position ourselves with tools and skills to be prepared so we can manage, respond, and minimize harm for the greatest variety of possibilities. Disaster managers describe a binary disaster framework. And she shows this thing where maybe I have a picture of it. I know I have a picture of it. Maybe I can find it. Where they draw an actual, here it is, a line, and there's the boom in the middle. She refers throughout the book to disasters as the boom. I don't say it too often. I don't really like that. But she talks about the right side of it and the left side of it. The left side being before it happens, boom, it happens, and then the right side after it happens. It's a way to visualize, and she says this is a detriment, really. She says we focus on the left, how to prepare, and on the right, how to recover, and we need to be more in the center. The left, she says, we do things like missile defenses and carbon reduction and bike helmets and bike lights and seatbelts in cars, anything done to avoid a potential disaster. The boom is all possible hazards. And on the right side is the stuff we do to recover in the aftermath. She says there are fewer specialized reactions to a disaster than you would think. A lot of disasters can be reacted to in very similar ways, which is a good thing because that means we can prepare. We need to accept this commonality, and we need to accept the inevitability and the frequency of disasters. We are as a species, massively in denial most of the time, and we need to focus on management skills and things would not be so bad. This book highlights the recurring features of disaster management. She said the number one goal in this book is to make people stop being so surprised. What did you think? Of course something terrible was going to happen. It's a bit of a, I wouldn't call it a pessimistic approach to life. I would say it's realistic, that history has shown us that this is true. So we need to structure ourselves around probability, and we'll need skills to minimize the harm, to mitigate the damage done. We need to recognize that the widest ongoing and recurrent potential for a disaster does exist, and that within that framework we can prepare responses. She said, get over the paradox, the preparedness paradox, that getting ready for one type of disaster and that one is therefore avoided or lessened, and then naysayers will see, look, there was nothing to worry about, nothing bad happened. Well, they lose track of the fact that maybe nothing terrible happened, or maybe it was less bad because they were prepared for that specific disaster. It's a paradox. Preparedness makes people want to reject preparedness. Naysayers will say that the prep was unnecessary because the consequences were less. And just remember that the devil never sleeps. And she said you can use COVID as a disaster framework, a work guide for other disasters. She said screaming the sky is falling isn't enough. You need preparation, and you need to recognize that your preparation is never done. It's never complete. And we're going to get right down to the nitty-gritty. I thought this book was going to be about, so tomorrow this is what you need to do about getting batteries. And it's not like that, but I'm going to do a bit of that. She said there's no finish line. You can't prevent disasters. You have to focus on the consequences and minimizing the consequences, making things less bad. You can't avoid the devil, but you can work so that his constant return is less tragic. We're not helpless, and success is not binary. It's not either all good or all bad. Success is less bad. We can learn from disaster what steps to take to better prepare for the inevitable. So each chapter of this book draws 8 important lessons on a given disaster from the past to prepare how to deal with the future. Chapters 1, 2, 3 are the essential building blocks of disaster management. You have to accept that prevention will fail, often does. You have to know how to listen and communicate during the disaster as it's going on, and how to unify your efforts of response so that people are not working at cross purposes, and anticipate who's going to do what. That's very important, and that's important on a family level. Chapter 4 to 6, it's best practices to limit harm. Avoiding the least line of defense, which we'll talk about. Very important to constantly be updating and testing your plan, testing your response systems, and learn to do what she calls how to stop the bleed. We'll get into that. Chapters 7 and 8 are how to learn now for the next time. And all of these things sounds like a lot, but they can be done simultaneously. It's not as overwhelming as you think. She said, woulda, coulda, shoulda is a good standard for preparation for the devil. You need to position yourselves more safely, and this book is a call to action. Always do better the next time. Now, this book, I think, is probably aimed at management people in organizations and government. Still really interesting. But we'll talk a little bit more about, she does talk about families also and smaller communities. We need to get our heads around the inevitability of disasters. That's the big message in this book, is pull your head out of the sand, realize, okay, this is going to be inevitable at some point. That doesn't make you neurotic. That makes you smart. And this seems to be beyond our thinking. We have what she calls willful blindness, and we do a lot of short-term planning. And in a difference between a crisis and a disaster and a catastrophe, the amount of planning you do can make a big difference. A crisis is something unexpected and unwanted happens, and there aren't any consequences, but it does require a response while it's happening. So the example she used was that plane that crashed into the icy river. The captain managed to land the plane on the ice. That was a crisis. It could have been a disaster. It could have been a catastrophe. But he managed to save all those people. There was a response. He came up with the response, and it was okay. So it's a potential disaster averted. A disaster is when a crisis is not properly addressed, and this is not assessing blame on people. It's just saying that it wasn't handled enough to stop it, and there are horrific consequences. And an example of that were the California fires, which we'll talk about more. And a catastrophe, she says, is a poorly managed disaster. There's more damage than there ever should have been. And an example of that is Hurricane Ida in 2021. She said people drowned in their basements in New York City. That should never have happened. People should have been aware that because of the level, the relationship to sea level of these basements, the potential for flooding, this should have been anticipated, and it wasn't. So any of these things can occur, she says, after the devil arrives. The crisis is an event that's life-threatening. It requires high priority response, and it has a restricted response time. You have to act right away. And it's unexpected that there'll be a failure to deal with. But if there's a failure, then you don't have a crisis anymore. You have a disaster. And even that should be no surprise. And it's not if you're prepared. It's like carrying an umbrella in your car. It doesn't mean that all the time it's going to be raining, but it's handy to have it to respond. You don't get soaked and cold. And she says it's dangerous. Excuse me. Dangerous to focus on the element of surprise as a precondition for a crisis. Oftentimes, the actual unexpectedness of a crisis can cause paralysis. People fight, flight, or freeze, and many people freeze in a crisis. She said that because of the preparedness paradox, which we talked about, successful preparation measures can seem like a waste of time. This would be everybody in my family making fun of me for buying extra tuna over time, or N95 masks, years ago. And we need to learn to not do that, and we need to learn to be impervious to that sort of criticism. It's not neurotic to prepare because crisis is inevitable. She said the excuse is that, the failure to do your preparation, there's a crisis, and if you do prepare, then you seem like you're a paranoid, neurotic person. And it's hard for other people to see the benefits of the preparation that you did. And it's hard to see the justification for having prepped. And there's less chance of harm. So why not prep? You need to ask, would a disaster be worse if we didn't prepare? And the answer is almost always yes. So if they work, successful measures often seem like a waste of time. I've got a little corner in my garage with all kinds of weird stuff. Rolls of plastic sheeting and a crowbar. And, they love to laugh at me for that. But boy, I'll tell you what, when an earthquake happens and your windows break, and we live in a rainy place where earthquakes happen, you're in big trouble. If your electricity goes out, you don't have heat, your windows are open to the environment, and it's raining. All I had to do was buy some rolls of duct tape and plastic sheeting. And we'll see who's laughing next. So they can seem like a waste of time. And with large-scale events like COVID and climate change, it can be difficult to spur to action the people who really can make a difference. You must start way ahead of time. It seems like a huge overreaction because nobody can actually see what's coming. And when harm is limited, people tend to think that the effort of getting ready was unnecessary. It's like calling a snow day that doesn't end up dumping snow. People go, see, you overreacted. We shouldn't have closed the schools. And then she says, yeah, that's what seems like on the surface. But suppose it had snowed and you had people traveling on snowy, icy roads. You have to assume that your reaction is going to protect people. And if it ends up that they didn't need quite as much protection, you're ready for the next time. When harm is limited, people think the effort was unnecessary. Preparedness paradox is actually an epidemiological term. So, epidemics. The majority of cases of a disease come from the low and moderate risk people. And it's because high risk people are prepared for the worst. And people who think, oh, it's okay, they're the ones who end up getting sick. I could tell you stories. Only a minority of people from the high risk group will prepare, and that's because the total number of high-risk people is low that you see these huge epidemics happening. So to prepare for a disease by focusing on a high-risk population seems like a waste because it covers this smaller number of people, but it's not a waste. An example would be Y2K. I remember doing a little tiny bit of preparation for Y2K. We weren't in anywhere near as reliant on computers in our home lives. No one was really. Businesses were much more. And so the concern was that when the clock ticked over, because of technology, a lot of computers wouldn't recognize the date change and would freak out. So banks and emergency services, telephone companies before cell phones were big, those sorts of businesses were really, really worried. And the rest of us had to be concerned that there would be a certain amount of social unrest. And nothing happened. She said, well, there's a reason why nothing happened. It wasn't because Y2K wasn't a threat. She said it's because they spent upwards of $600 billion to ameliorate what might happen and to prepare for the event. When the clocks turned over and very little happened, everyone said, what was the big deal? This was an overreaction. They made fun of everybody. But she said in reality, there was a year of prep and over $600 billion, a lot of money, was spent to prevent a disaster, and it worked. So an action to prevent a disaster can be self-defeating for the future. You worry too much. We don't need to. It'll be just like Y2K. It'll be nothing. Well, she said the myth of Y2K is that it was exaggerated, and the skepticism about disaster after that became a norm, that Y2K was a hoax. She goes, it wasn't. A lot of effort went into preventing it from being a disaster. Today we know that the Y2K prep worked, that the threat was real, and we need to commit to a sustained level of preparation on a business level, organizational level, government level, family level. She doesn't ask why or whether or how bad things happen. She read this book called The Ostrich Paradox by Meyer and Kumuther. Why do authors and scientists always have really difficult names? She attributes leadership biases, the book does, attributes leadership biases to the plague of not being prepared. So let's look at that. And what are these leadership biases? Myopia, amnesia, optimism, inertia, simplification, and herding. So what do we know about this? She says that people try to see no evil. They believe the devil doesn't exist. These are low probability, high consequence events that you're getting ready for. People don't see it. And her example is what's called a black swan event. She said that it was highly improbable. People did not believe before 1697. People did not believe black swans existed. There is no such thing as a black swan. And then lo and behold, 1697, they saw some black swans. This is a low probability, high consequence event. It was so rare that even a possibility of them is just unknown, unthinkable. 9/11. It's got a catastrophic impact. Well, maybe swans don't, but it's a metaphor. And it can be explained in hindsight as though it were predictable. It seems obvious after the fact. Well, of course we should have known that this 9/11 event was going to happen. But black swan events can't always be predicted and seem to be unthinkable. They almost challenge our ability to imagine. Although there's more to 9/11 than meets the eye, but that's for another book. The rules of probability don't apply to them because they're so rare and it's difficult to anticipate. She attempts to learn from the past that these black swan events make us more vulnerable. The past is not a good guide for future risk. It does nobody any good to say, well, look at the past. You don't have to worry about that. That's never happened. Institutions must build robustness to negative events. It's really vital. Then she talks about the book Gray Rhino by somebody called Wooker. And this focuses on high probability, high consequence events, things that are right in front of us that go completely unrecognized. The risk assessment is the frequency of the probability of the consequences of an event. So people will say, well, let Darwin take care of low probability, high consequence events. Let Darwin worry about the black swans. How often is that going to happen? For example, the example she uses, I just thought this was really funny. I know this is a tragedy. I apologize if this is a family member of yours, but you remember that book, the Darwin Awards? People who fall into the Grand Canyon taking selfies. No comment. She says the high probability and low consequence events can also be pretty much ignored. And that would be like a fender bender. You can deal with that. It happens all the time. No harm, no foul. But we can't control probabilities at all, really. You can't control something that you can't anticipate. But what you can do is imagine the consequences and prepare for them. So all we need to do is to consider high or lower high consequence events. And therefore what really matters is more or less consequential. We must accept that disasters will come. 100%. Calculating probabilities of the risks is an art, and it's hard, and it's impossible to control, but the potential for disaster is normal. And it's best to do your security planning if you're a business or a government, or even if you have just a home. Anticipating all the types of potential threats, and you do that as a homeowner. You think about things like plumbing issues and fires and, carbon monoxide. You have to prioritize your resources, and this is especially true for families. Resources to protect against all threats are more important to invest in than something really, really, really specific. I don't know if she mentioned an example here. I'll try to think of something on a family level. Disasters share common attributes. that occur in the aftermath of the event. So a tornado and an earthquake and a flood are very different experiences, but the aftermaths of all of those share common denominators. So disasters require that we recognize their novelty and are able to manipulate, improvise our response to account for the novelty. They're big. They require a massive response across physical and professional boundaries that need to work together. We need situational awareness. You know, if you're going to build a house, try not to build it on a floodplain. The response has to be flexible. She emphasizes this constantly. You have to be prepared. Your preparations have to account as much as possible for a variety of different potentials. She says, no matter what, a disaster will be bigger than is planned for. It will be messy. You can 100% expect that from the experience of people who deal with disasters. She says it's not an overreaction 24/7, and it's not an underreaction that can turn an emergency. It's not an overreaction 24/7 to be prepared. It's an underreaction that can turn an emergency into a calamity. It's actually the people who are not prepared who have the worst outcomes. In 2014, there was a snowstorm in Atlanta, and they were unprepared for snow. They had no plan for this blizzard response, which would be anywhere else that was used to blizzards, everybody stay home. So what happened is everyone went to work, and then they decided, maybe we should send everybody home. So everyone left work at the same time. This is bad disaster reaction. You don't do that. You send people in staggered amounts. You tell everybody to stay home. But if you have to send people home, you do it in a staggered amount so that the roadways aren't crowded. People got stuck on the icy roads. People got stuck in their cars for 18 hours. And they were unfamiliar with the conditions. They weren't prepared for snow. The city of Atlanta could have known, even though it rarely happens, you prepare for things that rarely happen. And part of a good city planning would be the once in every 5 decades that we have a snowstorm, a blizzard. We don't want to be the ones responsible for people's deaths. So let's factor that into our planning and run through the possibility of what we're going to do if that happens. And likewise, families need to prepare themselves for any weird thing. I mean, now tornadoes are happening in places that never had tornadoes. You need to know what to do. So we're going to talk about that. She says the devil has no new tricks. It's just a variety of tricks, but no brand new ones. So I think this next little story that she provides is really interesting because it was actually very similar to my family's experience. So now my husband worked in the hospital, and I'm always reading, right? And I picked up on in December of 2019 that there was something weird going on in China. And we had a little conversation about it, and I'm ashamed to admit, and I've admitted this before, that we had a private joke, my husband and I, when things get really bad, like when Donald Trump won the election. And when people do horrible, horrible things to the environment, we joked, well, don't worry about it. Doesn't matter. All we need is one good pandemic. Sorry, you guys. So my antennae went up. My husband's antennae went up. Microbiology was his thing. And in January, he worked at a hospital. They were on red alert, but they weren't telling anybody. So it's important that people know that. Well, I wouldn't say they were on red alert doing anything about it, because when he tried to take time off because he's old and has bad heart and didn't want to be exposed, working in a medical laboratory with no masks, They told them all, don't overreact. Classic, right? According to this book. She had this really interesting experience. So in January 4th of 2020, she had a friend in China. And her friend in China called her and said, listen, there's this new flu, pneumonia, a new pneumonia going around. And it's really bad. And they're not putting it in the media. So Juliette called who? Because, she's connected. She called the World Health Organization. And, no, I'm sorry. I misread my notes here. You should see my handwriting. China called in the World Health Organization, and she found out about it. And she was like, oh, why would they do that? This is really a red flag. But she said the United States government didn't react at all. And she was working for Homeland Security. She was freaking out. And then China and Italy went bonkers with COVID. So she warned her family and her friends, and she tried to warn the public, and she was told to shut up. So she told CNN in early March in a town hall, she was asked for her opinion. What should America do about this whole thing? And she said, shut it down. So here's what she has to say about that. Anderson Cooper said, incredulously, when you say shut it down, do you mean... To which I interrupted, everything. My mother texted me to tell me she thought I sounded harsh, that I was scaring people. That was my point. The devil was on his way, but we weren't ready, and any preventative action when there are so few cases of COVID in the U.S. seemed borderline paranoid. You're getting me nervous, Dante Ramos, an old friend and senior editor at The Atlantic, wrote to me. He'd been noticing my Twitter feed, which had become a bit of a megaphone, and sensed a rare panic in my tone. He asked if I would write for them. The Atlantic would stand out throughout the first pandemic year for providing some of the best coverage and analysis. So I wrote what I was worried about. The devil was coming. What will you call it? I asked after filing my essay. On March 8th, 2020, my piece called "The U.S. is Not Ready for What's About to Happen" appeared and found a big audience, probably because it validated a growing sense of public unease. It warned of what soon was going to happen to the American public. Especially at this point, even a more vigorous response will not preclude a lot of people from getting sick. Preventing all infections was no longer a possibility. And the measure of success is how much public health authorities can reduce the number of people who die or fall seriously ill. She wrote this. Reading it now, I realize that I was already on to consequence minimization, which is what disaster planning is really about. The risk could not be eliminated. Dante later told me he initially worried the title was alarmist. As it turned out, within a few weeks, the piece proved relatively accurate. Strangers wrote to me to thank me for the advice at a time when the national leadership offered little. People knew that something did not seem right, that a dangerous event was on the horizon, but they felt that they were alone. She knew, as I think most scientists already knew, that this was an uncontained, unrecognized virus, and they knew that it was going to spread. And they needed preparation. They needed to overreact, to mitigate the consequences. She says it's difficult because people are going to die. The question is how many people were going to die. They had a choice. 50,000, maybe, if they did something. And then, her estimate, 500,000 if they did nothing, and it's proven to be worse. In mid-March, her Atlantic article had a response support from a Professor Ian Bogost, who wrote that we need to overreact. She said she was prepping already personally, and she was horrified to see people going on with life just as usual. Her family was getting ready. They told her they didn't want to look like fools. Well, some of us are used to that. She said in the 1960s, public attitudes started to change. It used to be that overreaction couldn't be helped. It was like blinking in a sandstorm. It can't be helped. It was impulsive and it wasn't considered overreaction. But in the 60s, she said, people became more judgmental morally. And people started to rely more on psychological counseling and started to define more human behavior as neurotic. And they tried more to control emotions. And also, parallel to that, money became a huge consideration as World War II economy, at the time still, was all about not hurting business. That became the huge consideration. Overreacting became worthy of moral condemnation. It was judged a waste of resources for businesses and an individual failing to be gotten rid of, overcome. But Professor Bogart believed that disasters are common enough that overreacting is really just appropriate. You should stop mislabeling it as something negative. It often requires changes in response, too, as the understanding of a disaster develops. And a perfect example of that is COVID. You, I'm sure, heard people complaining, why doesn't the CDC make up its mind? First it was masks, then it was no masks. First it was distancing, then it was more or less distancing. And a virus changes, and as our understanding of it grows, our response to it must change. That's appropriate disaster response. You shift gears, you change directions, you do whatever it takes to mitigate the consequences. So instead of saying never again, we need to recognize always again, and disasters are recurring, and we have to focus on just bringing the consequences down. She says, are we safe? No. And we need to grow up, and we need to acknowledge life is fraught. That doesn't mean we have to hide under the covers. We need to be smart about what we do to mitigate the consequences of this lack of predictability, lack of safety. Can we be safer? Always. You could always be safer. Disasters reveal our identity, our culture, and our systemic problems that we ignore a lot. A disaster will bring all of that to the surface. For example, the quake in Haiti. She said, Haiti was impoverished in part by the United States military and political incursions into Haiti. It all became apparent after the quake. Hurricane Katrina, perfect example of just institutionalized racism across all institutions, the medical care, urban planning, government reaction, police reaction, economic inequalities. And New Orleans was the center of the slave trade. Another way of saying this is chickens coming home to roost. What goes around comes around. Fukushima, just a perfect example. Their oversight was lax. It all became apparent after that earthquake. The oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico brought to the surface our dependence on offshore drilling and our severe need for green energy sources. She says the devil challenges our blissful, willful ignorance. And if we move on and forget about the past because we treat a disaster as an aberration or just a surprise, then the devil has won. We need to minimize consequences with layered responses. We can, instead of ignoring or fearing disasters, we can prepare, and we can make it less bad by multiple layers from different sources of preparation. And she said airports do this in response to 9/11. There are no-fly lists. There are cameras all over the place as you come in with your baggage. Baggage is examined. TSA goes through everybody. The cockpits are locked. There are marshals in the plane. Many layers of response. And then we have to pull up our grown-up underwear and admit that there are levels of acceptable losses, which sounds terrible. Let me explain. 1 person dead is better than 10 people dead. That's what she means by that. You react to the quarantine. You react to the COVID to prevent hundreds of thousands of people dying, and accept the fact that tens of thousands inevitably will. That doesn't mean you offer people up as sacrificial lambs. Don't get that wrong. She says the military does this. This is hardwired into how the military handles things. It doesn't pretend it can keep its losses at zero. It acknowledges that people will die, but let's have the least number of people die as possible. So we want to know how to better have readiness instead of worrying about prevention. It's not possible to prevent. You have to plan to mitigate the consequences. You have to focus on the now. She says, you are here. She ends each chapter by summarizing and saying, you are here. This is where we are. Put the immediacy of preparation at the forefront instead of always putting it off, always having it hanging over your head. And this is on an individual basis because I know how this is. Always worrying, man, I really should do that. She said, yeah, well, we'll talk about it. But you make a list and you prioritize the list and you get to work one day at a time. She said, we're extremely vulnerable. That's the reality of humanity. And you have to take your sense of extreme vulnerability and balance it against total neurosis and come to a real response. And less bad, she said, is the standard of success for crisis management. So now we're just starting chapter 1. So that was the introduction. She had assumed the boom. May Day is a day too late. So in 2018, this is just unbelievable. Talk about corporate greed. Oh my God. 2018, 2019, 2 Boeing 737 MAX planes crashed separate times, killing a total of 346 people. Why? The pilots weren't able to override a new system that forced the nose of the plane down because they'd not been trained how to do it. And we know this because a whistleblower had come out and warned everybody that this was going to happen, was ignored. They had to get this airplane in the sky. They had to get it rolled out before it was really ready because they were in financial competition with Airbus. Boeing told the FAA that the plane was just an improvement on old stuff, nothing new to look at here, no need for rigorous regulatory processes that happen when you're presenting new technology. They lied to the FAA. And they sold the plane to the airlines that bought the plane as a new and unique technology to get them to buy it in competition with Airbus. So Boeing lied. It told the airlines that there was no new training needed. And so between the 2 crashes, Boeing could have responded to prevent the second crash. But they blamed the first crash on a replacement sensor and a fluke. And they tried to blame a subcontractor for it. And the second crash grounded all of their planes of this sort for 2 years. Airplanes in general are inherently complicated and failures are inevitable. This is an accepted point of view. The question is, how do you mitigate and minimize the consequences? So they engineer that into the design of planes. Boeing knew the problem. It didn't act. It failed to provide alternatives to an unstable device on the plane. It recognized the vulnerability. It didn't use many tactics in its arsenal to avoid catastrophe. The pilots could have been trained to the new system, but the plane was sold as old technology. They were in too big of a rush to market it. The FAA has become less aggressive in deference to these market pressures, so the FAA is culpable. In 1997, Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas. I didn't know that. It kept the name Boeing, but it merged with McDonnell Douglas, which was a corporate kind of culture. Boeing was a family culture. They very much felt part of a large family and were treated thus. McDonnell Douglas were very much the corporate mode. Money trumped everything. And this alienated the employees who used to be a family. Now they were a team. You know how I feel about that word. It was a culture shift, and it focused on penny pinching. The employees lost pride in making the planes. They lost their emotional connection to the company. Greed was a huge factor, but she said it's more complicated than that. It includes leadership, the corporate culture, the actual technology, the money involved, and luck. They didn't factor in the risk that corporate group think would have or would create, which has a disregard for loss. And this is a very important feature of disaster management. You can't fight it. You have to acknowledge that loss will happen. She said it's important to do simulations and exercises. And, you can't run through a plane crash, but they have what's called tabletops. Well, they run through all the possible scenarios, and they bring in people not associated with the company whose specialty is doing this. And they throw out scenarios and put people on the spot. What have you got in place? How are you going to react? And then what? And then what? And then what? And, they do that in schools. They have fire drills. You have to refresh people's memory. You do these simulations and exercise. You take people through the possibilities. And it's amazing how leaders explain that a crisis could never occur. They'll sit at these tabletops and they'll put a scenario in front of them, and they'll say, we don't have to worry about that. That could never happen. They don't prepare. They deny the possibility. Her advice is, it's coming. Get your head around it. Stuff's going to happen. So instead of being a child and hiding your head in the sand, acknowledge, okay, what can we do to be the most ready? In 2014, this is a funny example. 2014, Sony had a movie called The Interview, and it was a plot to assassinate Kim in North Korea. It's a comedy. I've seen it. It is hilarious. And North Korea got really upset about it because apparently they have no sense of humor. And they did a huge hack into the Sony network. They got all sorts of private information, shut down the network, and it was done by, for sure they know, by these people in North Korea working for the government. And it revealed how vulnerable national security is. James Clapper says that there are only two conditions in life: policy success or intelligence failure. So Sony assumed that there was no risk and had done very little to protect itself. And she says this is wishful thinking. North Korea considers Kim a god. And a movie, Sony considered that there was no risk for this movie. And she said, come on, consider the culture you're talking about. And of course they were going to be insulted. Sony had been hacked before, and it took no steps to prevent it, no precautions. Couldn't imagine that this would happen. And it even used passwords like 1234, A, B, C, D. Even I don't do that. So what does an emergency response look like? Why don't I stop here? Because it's a good time to stop and a good place to stop. So I will upload this and immediately begin number 2. And I don't think this is going to be as long a series of videos. And remember the last video, hopefully included at the end of the last video. Just depends on if it'll be separate or not. But today I will do a video on personal disaster preparedness. So thank you for watching. I hope you're enjoying this. It is interesting. It's very interesting. So thank you, and I'll be back.